Hello, Dean. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Can you see me and hear me properly? Is everything okay?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean, for taking the time and agreeing to do this and making this possible. I know we talked about this about a month ago, but I think you were busy with an online seminar, I think, that you were doing about mobility, right?
Yeah, I was supposed to be doing a live event in Vancouver, but unfortunately, travel restrictions came up and global
Right.
pandemics happened, so I moved it to a webinar-based format. So yeah,
Uh,
it seemed to go pretty well. I'm pretty happy with how everything turned out, and the feedback seems to be pretty beneficial. So I'm happy with that.
yeah, surprisingly, a lot of people have changed their way of training after this pandemic. So they are pretty fine with doing whatever they can with the internet. So
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, well, you kind of have to do it this way because there's
yeah,
really no other option. So
correct.
people pivot pretty quickly.
Awesome. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. Today on the Fit Geek Show, we have Dean Somerset, all the way from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Am I right?
That is correct, yes.
Yes. And I know that a lot of confusion is going on in the fitness industry, especially in India, about mobility. It's that kind of a thing that the trainers know that it's important, the clients know that it's important, but they don't know how to go about it. They don't know
Mhm.
anything about it. I mean, not everyone, but like I've seen, majority of people are um, a little confused about it. So that's why we have Dean Somerset today, who happens to be a mobility specialist as well. He has a bachelor's in kinesiology. He is a medical exercise specialist, a certified exercise physiologist, and also an NSCA strength and conditioning specialist. So thank you so much, Dean. And we look forward to hearing from you and learning a lot from you.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So my first question would be, how did you even get introduced to the career of fitness, and what drove you to accept this as your future career?
Well, part of it was I played a lot of sports growing up, and I was very
Hmm.
bad at all of them. I wasn't really a standout athlete at all. So I was always
Okay.
trying to find ways to become better at sports. So that led me into the weight room, which led me to loving doing strength training and saw some really good results very early. After that, I thought, well, why don't I try to find a way to make this into a career? Because my entire family were tradespeople, which is fantastic, but it wasn't
Hmm.
something where I was like, well, I want to do that. I wanted to
Hmm.
do stuff like lift weights, talk about anatomy, physiology, be a geek. So as a
Hmm.
result of that, I started going into a kinesiology degree, and I had initial thoughts of getting into physiotherapy or into medical school, but I thought, well, I kind of just want to spend most of my time in a gym. So why
Hmm.
would I want to get a career where I would spend most of my time in a clinic when I really wanted to spend time in a gym? So I just finished up my degree, got certifications where I could work with a bunch of people in kind of bridging that gap between the medical world and the fitness world as much as possible, and
Hmm.
I've been able to develop a pretty decent career since then.
Awesome. So how many years has it been since you started this career?
I graduated with my degree in 2004, so I've been
Okay.
training clients for about 17 years now.
Wow, that's a long time, lot of experience.
Mhm.
Awesome. So coming back to our topic, what is mobility, and what is your definition of mobility?
So there's two working definitions for mobility that people need to be aware of. One is active range of motion, which is if I were to say I want to put my arm over my head, how far into that range of motion can I actually get my arm? Another is
Hmm.
passive mobility. So if somebody else was to grab my arm and move it through that range of motion, how far before bones hit other bones or capsules stop that range of motion from occurring? So if I have sufficient passive range of motion and effective active range of motion, I'm
Hmm.
using most of what I have available from a structural perspective, a genetic perspective, all that kind of stuff. If I
Hmm.
have a lot of passive range of motion, but then I can't control the active range of motion through that full spectrum, then we have a mismatch of mobility versus structure. So I would want to be able to work on improving the mobility element of things, not necessarily the passive range, which is known as flexibility. So another way to think of it is if I wanted to go into the splits, I would just kind of put one leg forward, put one leg back, and then sink down into it. That is flexibility. So I'm not trying to pull myself into that position. I'm trying to just lower down into it. If I tried to
Hmm.
do a high kick like Jean-Claude Van Damme back in the 80s, then that would be mobility. So the difference between passive versus active range of motion. Now, if somebody wants to do something like, let's say, a deep squat, they have to have the passive range of motion for the joints to allow them to get into that position. But then they also have to have the active range of motion control to get into that position and get back out. I've worked with some clients who are very hypermobile and they can squat to the floor, but then they can't get back up. So that's a
Mm.
bit of a problem, because when you get down there, how do you actually utilize that range of motion in a way that allows you to do the stuff you want to do? So when it
Mhm.
comes to defining mobility, it comes down to, is there a structural element that's affecting that mobility? And then is there a neuromuscular element that's affecting that mobility?
Okay, so mobility consists of two, the structural and neuromuscular. And
Correct.
so these can be worked on through progressive training, or how can a person go about it in their training?
So when if you have sufficient passive mobility, that's kind of step one. Then when you're doing things like active mobility, you can do that through positional isometrics, pattern grooving, eccentrics, all the types of training programs that we've seen out there. Static stretching does not improve active range of motion. It's something that can
Mm.
be very beneficial for passive range of motion or for decreasing tone that might be affecting your range of motion. So when it comes to, if you don't have sufficient passive range of motion, there's a couple of
Hmm.
small things that you can do. One of them is very long hold static stretching. So when I say
Hmm.
very long hold, I'm talking like 8 to 10 hours a day or longer. A good
Wow.
way to consider it is if you've ever had orthodontic work or braces on your teeth, that's a
Hmm.
force application to a joint capsule that's on 24/7 for as long as you have those braces on. So that's very long hold static stretching. My
Hmm.
wife unfortunately dislocated her elbow last summer, and her elbow became fibrotic as a result of that traumatic event. So when she was going through the rehab, her elbow was very stiff. She had to go through progressive splinting, which meant that they
Hmm.
progressively pulled it into flexion further and further
Hmm.
with a brace that she had to wear for 8 hours a day. And then she also had to have a brace on that pushed her into extension for 8 hours a day.
Hmm.
So she was progressively splinted for 16 hours a day, every day for about 6 weeks. So when it comes to affecting things like the joint structure, the capsule, ligamental integrity, a 30-second stretch really isn't going to do much to address that at all. It's going to do
Hmm.
more of addressing the neuromuscular tension that might be holding a muscle in a tight spot, preventing it from
Hmm.
releasing and opening up and getting the full effect of that sarcomere. But when it comes to addressing the passive range of motion or the structural elements, very long hold static stretching or progressive splinting is usually the only way that that can be approached.
Okay, that's quite a deep explanation for it. Thank you. And so, what is the importance of mobility training in the warm up? Because I have heard from different people and I've read a few articles that mobility training is a little important when it comes to warming up, so that prepares you for the actual sport routine or workout routine. So, is there anything like that? Science says that.
Yep. So when it comes to doing a warm up, essentially it's going to allow you to make tissues more compliant with the work that you're trying to do. So let's use an
Hmm.
example of a run, for example. You're exposing the body to impact forces on the ground every time your foot hits the ground. There's a stretch
Right.
shortening phase, there's reflexive stimulation, there's vascular stuff that's happening. So blood vessels have to expand to be able to accommodate new blood flow. And a lot of that
Hmm.
takes energy and a lot of that takes work.
Hmm.
So it's something that as somebody gets older, they're going to be more resistant to change. So, and one
Hmm.
thing I found with a lot of my clients as they go from their 50s to 60s to 70s, they take longer to warm up because their bodies are resistant to change compared to somebody in a 20-year. So a 20-year-old
Right.
can come into the gym and just start sprinting right off the bat. A
Hmm.
70-year-old, it might take them a half hour or 40 minutes to get to a top working set,
Hmm.
but that's what they need to do to be able to get to that state. So in terms of mobility, essentially what you're trying to do is groove the pattern of whatever it is that you're trying to do and get the
Hmm.
tissues to become more compliant. So that involves using big range of motion, progressive loading, progressive velocity, making the tissue get a little bit of a stretch response out of it.
Hmm.
Another big one, I think my earpiece just cut out there, so I don't know why my
Oh.
earphones are being a little problematic, but another big one is overcoming myotatic reflex. So if I was
Hmm.
to whack my patellar tendon, it would cause my knee to flip out. So the typical doctor's
Right.
reflex. So if I
Hmm.
have myotatic reflex kicked up to high gear, if I go into a squat, it's going to go bang, and it's going to get that stimulation and make me feel like I tweak something. So if
Hmm.
I can overcome that reflex with a progressive warm up and decrease sensitivity to that stretch, then I can overcome that myotatic reflex and make it so I can utilize that range of motion without feeling that sudden tweak of going into a range of motion like I would I was doing a squat and my back decided to go, or my knee decided to go, or my calf or
Mhm.
something.
Okay, okay. And I know you mentioned this before that mobility training does help with resistance training as well. But how important is training in mobility before a heavy resistance training session?
Well, there's two things to remember with mobility training. There's sufficient mobility and then there's excessive mobility. So it's
Okay.
not just that, like if I was to do a squat and my goal was to get my hips to parallel and then come back up, being able to squat lower than that doesn't get me any bonus points. You want to
Hmm.
still go through as much of a range of motion as available, but more
Hmm.
mobility is necessarily going to always be a better situation. You want to have
Hmm.
enough to do the stuff you want to do, but more than that isn't necessarily going to be beneficial. One thing to consider is what type of mobility you're using in your warm-up. If you just do static stretching, you can actually see a force decrease following
Hmm.
affect your strength training workouts. If you were to do something more active like body weight squats, skip drills, march drills, anything like that, that would really work a range of motion but get more of a twitch activation type sequence,
Hmm.
would actually increase force application, which would make you stronger during your workout. And I don't know about you, but if I'm doing strength stuff, I don't want to be weaker while I'm doing strength stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Um, does including mobility training before a training session reduce the chances of injuries?
Kind of, but it's tough to be able to quantify that specifically. So if
Okay.
you're, like I said, static stretching and decreasing force output, it's going to make things more challenging to be under load without a
Hmm.
risk. So if I'm doing things like standing quad stretches, which bring my heel to my butt and my quads get stretched out and loose, and then all of a sudden I can't use my quads as well to produce force. If I have a weight on my back, I got to move that weight one way or another. So I might shift my hips
Mm.
back, more of like a good morning back extension out of it, which
Right.
would to a greater injury risk on my lower back or my hips.
Hmm.
To say that that's going to happen, but that's just a scenario that might happen. So with stuff like that, it's a kind of a cautious thing where the type of stretching that you're doing will increase the compliance of the tissues to having stress, make them more adaptable to the type of training that you're doing, increase force production. But when it comes to reducing injury risk, that's kind
Hmm.
of a gray area because there's a lot of things that you could do to reduce risk, but
Hmm.
it's always kind of retroactive. It's going to be like looking back in time to see what you could have done different. There's very few things that you're going to be able to predict specific injury risks unless you know a lot about the individual that you're working with.
Okay, okay, that makes sense. And is it the same with endurance athletes? Does mobility training help endurance athletes, so like long distance cyclists or marathoners or long distance swimmers?
For swimmers, I would say yeah, because the technique involves specific range of motions that they have to get to, and just
Right.
getting through that range is going to become more of just like a pattern application kind of thing because swimming is
Hmm.
very oriented. For cyclists,
Hmm.
the bike can go. Like I work with a lot of cyclists where their warm up is the first 20K of their ride. For runners, it's
Oh.
kind of the same thing. They'll just get outside and start running.
Hmm.
Very few of them would actually do a warm up, but the ones that do are typically when they're coming back off of some type of injury,
Hmm.
trying to kind of get a feel for a tissue or get a feel for how that region is going. Most of them would do more of their mobility work afterwards. But that being said, I would not recommend or I would not hesitate to have a client go through like skip drills or pattern drills or basic march drills where they're trying to get
Hmm.
that motion through their hips and get that feel. It's
Hmm.
not so important to say, oh, let's do a sitting hip flexor stretch for 20 minutes before you go out for your 10K. That might be something to do afterwards to decrease that neural tension to get back to a resting state, but it's
Hmm.
not going to necessarily benefit you as a runner going out to start. What would benefit runners most is doing stuff that's going to get them fired up. So any
Hmm.
kind of low or moderate intensity plyometrics, skip drills, all that kind of stuff is going to be more beneficial before their activity versus doing stretching drills.
Okay. And if a beginner wants to include some mobility training in their daily routine, what short, brief advice would you give them? How do they go about structuring their mobility routine?
Well, there's nothing wrong with doing static stretching. It's something that I think has a lot of benefit as like a meditative, relaxive type thing. So if
Hmm.
you're wanting some of that, do it at the end of the night before you go to bed to get an easier sleep. When you wake up in the morning, if you find that some parts of your body are a bit stiffer and tighter, move them through a range of motion. Like go to what a comfortable end range would be and then come back up. Do anything that feels like it moves a joint through the range of motion that's
Hmm.
easily available. So that could be something like a leg swing, it could be a body weight squat, it could be a toe touch, it could be a shoulder circle, it could be a
Hmm.
rotation. You don't have to
Hmm.
force ranges of motion, but just kind of go to what a 4 or 5 out of 10 intensity of stretch would be, where one being I barely feel this, 10 being I'm being ripped in half. It doesn't have to
Hmm.
be too, just like, if I move here, okay, that's a gentle stretch.
Hmm.
Move over here, gentle stretch. You can
Hmm.
hold the stretch for as long as you want or as little as you want. For a lot of my clients, I recommend them doing more like repetitious stretches that have a small velocity component with a very short pause, just because it makes the activity a bit more palatable for the person who's doing it. But also, it gets more of that vascular effect where you're pumping fluid through a joint, which is going to have a benefit to what we're trying to do from that cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary state, and
Hmm.
also increase the compliance of the tissues to get that stretch, contract versus just long hold stretching.
Okay. And there's a lot of information going around in the fitness industry, especially in India, regarding foam rolling. And a lot of people, I've seen a lot of lifters doing foam rolling before every session, 7 days a week. And somewhere I had read that that's not the best way to go about it, but I just wanted your experience and expert advice on it. So, how does it go?
Foam rolling is great to use with people if they're just trying to do a self audit or if they're trying to address parts of their body that wouldn't be easily approached with a stretch. So if they were to just kind of pin a muscle, create pressure onto it, and create kind of an overstimulation of the receptors that might be causing muscle to be tight, it can have an
Hmm.
effect of creating that external relaxation and allow you to access range of motion. So a good way to consider foam rolling is very much like brushing your teeth. It's good
Okay.
tissue hygiene. Going well, therapist, chiropractor, physiotherapist would be like going to the doctor. They can get in
Hmm.
there deep and do all that kind of stuff and be able to do the deeper levels of manual therapy than you would be able to do on your own. But it also
Hmm.
works as a really good self audit before you start. If you get on the roller and you roll out your leg and you're like, oh, that spot is very tight today, I should spend
Hmm.
an extra 30 seconds on it. And then you move to another spot and you're like, wow, that's not so tight. You can move on to something else. It's not a matter of saying, well, you have to foam roll or it's
Hmm.
mandatory workouts. I know some people who've never touched a foam roller and they seem to be doing
Hmm.
pretty well. I know some
Hmm.
people who spend an hour foam rolling and then they're too tired from their warm up to actually train. So it depends on where you fall on the spectrum. So I would recommend to a lot of my clients use it as a self audit before you start training, 2 to 5 minutes, as long as it should be. If you're feeling
Hmm.
really stiff, right, spend a little bit more time on it and just see how you feel. But then as soon as you're done rolling, get up and move around. So a key thing is that when you take that tissue tension off, then you have to do something with it. You can't just
Hmm.
exist in a bag of completely laxness that's not doing anything. You have to kind of get up, move, and actually utilize that range of motion and train your body to be able to hold that position more effectively.
Okay. And this is another question that one of my clients had. What is hypermobility, and is it a bad condition? Is it maybe harmful or dangerous for the future? And does mobility training escalate the hypermobility?
So with hypermobility, it's there's a couple of different considerations with it. One, do you just have joints that have more range of motion? That's
Mm-hmm.
very common with a lot of people. I'm kind of higher on the hypermobility spectrum without being clinically hypermobile. My wife
Mm-hmm.
is much more into a clinical hypermobility spectrum. And number two is, do they have a connective tissue disorder where they have lower collagen to elastin ratios? So
Oh.
somebody like that, if they have just lower collagen, their tissues are going to be much more stretchable and pliable than somebody who
Mm-hmm.
has higher collagen and lower elastin. So if somebody has a connective tissue disorder, that's not just going to affect their muscle, it's going to affect all of their connective tissue, including hair, skin, digestive tract, reproductive tract, internal organs, all that kind of fun stuff. So for them, they might have very mild symptoms, very moderate, very severe. It
Mm-hmm.
might be where they just say, when I do any kind of repetitive activity, I feel like I develop overuse injuries quicker.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody who's a runner, who's very hypermobile, they're probably going to wind up developing tendonitis issues or bursitis issues at a higher rate than somebody who's not hypermobile.
Mm-hmm.
It might be better suited for doing things like strength training, but at the same time, you can't hit them with the same volume of intensity in a program without giving them adequate recovery because their tissues don't have that same compliance and they have that bit of stretch in them that allows them to break down more effectively. So a good way to think of it is that connective tissue is very much like the foundation of a building. If you have a building that's just set onto the ground and is 1 story tall, it doesn't need to be very strong. It doesn't need to be very dense, doesn't need to be very pliable or mobile. If that ground is loose shale, that building is probably going to slide off and fall over and do all sorts of stuff. So the foundation of the building is going to dictate how stable that house is. Now you can have a building that's way too stable. So if there's any kind of shift, like an earthquake or something like that, the entire building collapses down. Or you can have a building adapt to the stressors that are being put on it. So if I have a very, very dense collagen and very low elastin, my tissues are going to be rock solid. That means me trying to push into a range of motion is going to be next to impossible. It means I'll be able to do stuff all day long and never break down or develop overuse injuries, but you might develop traumatic injuries. For people the other side of the spectrum who are very hypermobile, they'll have a hard time gaining stability, and their passive tissues to hold a position aren't going to be able to do the job. So their active tissues then have to do the job. So these are the people who will complain of chronic neck tension. They get whiplash easily. Their SI joints go all the time. They have tendinopathies all the time whenever they do mild exercises. So their stability is being dictated more by active supportive tissues versus passive. So they have to work harder to maintain those tissues. They might be able to put their palms on the ground with straight knees, but there's a trade-off with that. No matter what, there's always going to be a cost of doing business when it comes to that. So if you're hypermobile, it'll predispose you to certain types of injuries more than somebody who's not hypermobile. So then it just comes down to how do you develop that training program.
Awesome. I think you have a question.
Yeah. So should these hypermobile clients execute max range of motion and exercise? Is joint stability the answer for them? It's kind of tough to say with that because there's a lot of variables behind it. I would say that max range of motion for each individual is going to be a big question mark. So I have some clients who are very hypermobile who max range of motion for something like internal rotation might be 180 degrees. So I wouldn't want to put through that range, but I would want to see what they could control through that range. It might be something where I say, I want you to do a hip rotation with only that hip moving. I want to see you do bracing drills to be able to control your position. A best way to consider it isn't necessarily max, but controlled max. So what can you control in that range? If we can get people to control that range, then they can work on creating that stabilization effect that we're looking for without pushing into the end ranges of really stretching out that tissue.
Okay. And is there any way that a person can reduce hypermobility or can combat the issue?
If it's a genetic thing, not really, because that's just part of their. So you can train the individual to respond to the training that you're putting them into. So if you do a lot of visualization, positional isometrics, posture work, if you do strength training but give adequate recovery time between strength training bouts, fantastic, best way that you could go. But in terms of training somebody out of hypermobility, it's probably not going to happen.
Okay. And this is regarding your the certifications that you've done. So you've done medical exercise specialist certification. So what does it allow you to work with? Like what kind of population?
So that one allowed me to work with clients that have pre-existing musculoskeletal injuries. So had ACL injuries, rotator cuff injuries, disc herniations, that kind of stuff. But it was just kind of like, here's the tip of the iceberg. Now you have to learn everything else. So it was a good starting point. My certification as an exercise physiologist let me work with cardiac rehab clients, all dysfunction clients, people that have things like cardiopulmonary dysfunctions, lipidemia dysfunctions, MS, all that kind of fun stuff on top of it. So I tend to work with people who other trainers would completely go white looking at, just like, no, I'm not touch that one. Those are the people who I seem to attract the most and get the most bang for buck for training them.
That's great. And what kind of online services do you provide?
A couple. I do a lot of free education on my website, deansomerset.com. I also do online coaching. I've got continuing education video products available. So if anyone needs to dig deeper into certain topics, I've got a library of that. I also do online consultations. So if somebody wants to jump on like a Skype or a Zoom call and they have a specific issue, I can help to walk them through that.
Awesome. And these continuing education credits, are they applied to ACSM, NSCA, or any organizations? Which kind of organization? Because I know a lot of Indians are doing the ACSM and NSCA, both of them. So,
Yeah, so for the ones that I go through, mostly it's directly approved for NSCA, but we've
okay.
had people use those credits to apply for credits through ACSM, NASM, a lot of different organizations, and then all they have to do is just submit their petition, say, here's the course I took, here's the credit that I got, and they can usually get a direct credit out of that.
Okay, awesome. And so these are the online services that you provide, but what are in-person services that you provide? Because I know there are a few Canadian followers as well.
In person right now, it's me in my basement working on training clients through virtual stuff.
Yeah.
In hopefully, when we can get back to being in gyms, I do in-person training in one-on-one and small group scenarios, and hopefully live events again, teaching workshops. But we'll see when that happens.
That's great. And have you ever addressed an Indian audience before, or this is the first time you've done this?
Um, Not directly addressing an Indian audience. I know I do have a
Okay.
number of followers in India, which is always
Okay.
people from the other side of the world want to hear a weird
Yeah.
Canadian and is talking about stuff, but I'm very appreciative of anybody who wants to hear me. So hopefully everyone who is listening in India is able to get a lot out of what I'm talking about today and appreciate where I'm coming
Yes, that's
from.
for
So
sure. Yes, because I know a bunch of exercise science students. So the degree in kinesiology is pretty new in India, and there are just two or three universities overall in India that offer this degree. And
yeah,
I know a few of them who are studying, and they really look forward to listening to lectures from fitness experts like you who've been in the industry for a long time. So they're definitely going to appreciate it. And I'm going to put this on Instagram TV as well, so they can watch it in the next whenever they want to watch it. And if somebody wants to reach out to you, where can they email you or message you?
Instagram works really well, but also if you want to look at my email, it's dean@deansomerset.com. So we can
Okay.
up in a link somewhere, but yeah, I'm easy to approach, and I get back to people as quickly as possible. Sometimes it might be a day, depending on time zones, but I'm willing to help out anybody who needs help. I figure there's been a lot of people who've helped me in my career, so paying it
Mhm.
the only way that we can make this fitness industry expand properly.
Love that attitude. Love that attitude. That's great. And then I hope everything's going safe in Edmonton. How's the condition of the coronavirus there?
Pretty good. We have very few active cases right now, and we're moving through phases to reopen and relaunch. So, my hope is right now it's in phase two. So, or sorry, phase one. We're moving into phase two in the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
Gyms are reopen in phase three, but they're talking about some fitness services in phase two. So, right now it's like, what do we do? But in the meantime, my wife and I are staying safe. We've got our house, we've got our basement gym. I'll give you a little tour of the basement gym if you like.
Oh, yes.
A nice banner on the wall over here. My wife's bikes. She's a traction bike.
Nice.
I've got landmine, dumbbells, trap bar, other barbells, squat rack. I've even got cable systems involved, so that way I can do high and low cable pull systems. Bands. My wife has some medals and jerseys and stuff. Got a heavy
Mhm.
bag. One of my clients won world championships for paracycling, so he gave me a jersey. Glute ham raise, trekking board, plyo box, and then we've got a TV, stereo, my wife's time trial bike, my spin bike, and then storage in the back. So now you got the grand tour of the basement of champions.
You're all set. I'm so jealous. I mean,
It's
because
nice.
I live in Mumbai, and like here the houses are so small. We don't even have houses. We have like apartments.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a trade-off when you live in a very urban center. We're kind of outside of the downtown of Edmonton, so it's a little bit more suburban. So
Nice.
we're able to have a decent-sized house that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. But there's,
Uh,
and I was thinking, I was like, where do I want to live in the world? Where would I be able to have a gym in my basement? And where would I be able to afford to live? Edmonton seems to be part of it.
nice. So are you born and brought up in Alberta, or you're from somewhere else?
No, I'm from British Columbia, which is the province to the west. So
Ah, okay.
Columbia, Vancouver is kind of the key point on that. I'm not from Vancouver, but I'm from the interior of British Columbia, so a
Okay.
very rural area. But yeah, I grew up there, and then I moved to Edmonton to get my degree at the University of Alberta.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dean, for taking the time and addressing us today. And I hope we get to learn a lot from you. And I look forward to having you in the future as well.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me. Hopefully everything's going well over in India too.
Oh, here in Mumbai, we are still in the middle of crisis, so things are not going to open up for at least a couple of months more. The number of people who've been detected with corona is increasing day by day. So,
Yeah.
but rest of India is opening up soon. Mumbai and like the big cities are a problem because we had a lot of international travelers here. So
Yeah.
that's why. But
Yeah.
yeah,
We're
yeah,
trying to
hoping for the
as much as possible and then hopefully contain everything. But well, we'll
yes.
see.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
You as well. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.